Ragnar Lothbrok's death in Season 4 of Vikings is one of the most unforgettable moments in the series. But did you know that a lot of people completely missed what was really happening? On the surface, it looked like a fallen king facing the wrath of his enemies with no escape. Look closer, though, and the pieces tell a very different story. There was a reason Ragnar let himself die, and today, we're going to talk about it. If you want more deep dives into the moments in film and pop culture that most people miss, make sure you subscribe now, because the truth about Ragnar's death can change the way you see the entire series. Now let's get into it. Few moments in Vikings are as burned into memory as the sight of Ragnar Lothbrok hanging in a cage above a pit of writhing snakes. His face is bruised and bloodied. The cold iron bars press against him as the cage hovers over the seething mass below. King Ælle of Northumbria stands nearby, eyes alight with vindication, while a gathered crowd watches. It's the kind of execution designed to humiliate as much as it is to kill. It looks like the final humiliation of a fallen king. Bound and displayed like an animal, Ragnar is powerless to stop what's coming. For Ælle, this is a performance. A public reckoning meant to strip away every shred of Ragnar's dignity before delivering the killing blow. The once great king has been beaten, captured, and caged, his life dangling, literally, above the venomous creatures waiting below. Yet even in this moment, Ragnar doesn't beg. He doesn't lash out. Instead, he speaks with measured words about Odin, Valhalla, and the fate that awaits him beyond death. There's no desperation in his voice, only certainty. Then, with a signal from Ælle, the chains rattle and the bottom of the cage swings open. In an instant, Ragnar drops into the pit. The snakes surge toward him, their bodies coiling and striking. It is a brutal, theatrical image. The fall of a man once feared across kingdoms, now swallowed by a pit of venom. To most, this is merely the end of Ragnar Lothbrok. A king broken, defeated, and destroyed in the most public way possible. The scene fits neatly into the story of a warrior who climbed too high and finally fell. But there's something that didn't quite fit that simple narrative. His complete lack of resistance. That is not the sign of a man caught off guard. That's the sign of someone who knew exactly how this would happen, and perhaps had been working toward it all along. The show doesn't stop to explain this, leaving the audience with the image and the assumption that defeat was inevitable. But in reality, this moment wasn't the collapse of Ragnar's plans. It was the plan. Now, to understand why Ragnar would allow himself to be caged, battered, and dropped into a pit of snakes, we have to go back, to the losses that reshaped him, to the betrayal that hollowed out his kingdom, and to the moment he began designing his own death. The road to Ragnar's death didn't begin with his capture in England. It began years earlier, when one decision shattered everything that had once made him untouchable. That decision was the settlement in Wessex, a vision he believed would secure a permanent future for his people beyond raiding. It was a bold gamble, built on a promise from King Ecbert to grant Viking settlers farmland. Ragnar trusted that promise, and in doing so, he sealed their fate. When Ragnar left the settlers in Wessex, he believed the deal would hold. Instead, Ecbert ordered their massacre. The fields meant for farming became a killing ground. Every man, woman, and child was wiped out. The betrayal was absolute, and in the eyes of Kattegat, the blame was shared. Ragnar had vouched for Ecbert. Ragnar had sent them there, and Ragnar had not been there to protect them. The weight of that loss cut deep. It wasn't just a political failure. It was a wound that never healed. It stripped Ragnar of his authority and burned away much of the loyalty he had earned. The cheers that once greeted him were replaced by whispers, doubts, and open contempt. His rivals saw weakness. His friends drifted away. Even his sons, now grown and forging their own paths, no longer saw him as the man to follow. Shame drove him into years of exile. When he finally returned to Kattegat, he was a shadow of the man he had been. Older, weathered, and with no army to command. He tried to rally support for one last voyage to England, but he knew before asking that no one would come. That, in fact, was the point. Ragnar's recruitment drive was as much a test as it was a performance. He went to each potential ally, each familiar face, asking for their help, fully expecting to be refused. Every rejection confirmed what he needed to know. His people had moved on. They no longer needed him. Those refusals freed him. They allowed him to say his farewells without the burden of lingering obligations. Before leaving, Ragnar sought out those who had mattered most to him. He visited Lagertha, not as a king, but as the man she had once loved. He faced his sons, speaking to them not as a commander but as a father, even when they dismissed his plans. These were not the moves of a man building a war party. They were the quiet steps of a man preparing to die. What he needed now was a voyage that looked real, but could not succeed. Sailing alone would only feed the perception that he had gone mad. To become a cause worth avenging, he had to make his final journey look like an earnest attempt at revenge for Wessex. So he bribed and recruited a crew of old men, warriors in name only, too frail to win a fight. Their very presence served his purpose, to make the voyage appear genuine while ensuring that no one would return home with a story that contradicted the one he wanted told. Ragnar knew exactly how this would end. He didn't intend to conquer. He intended to lose, in a way so public, so humiliating, that it would ignite the fury of every Viking who heard the tale. But to make that happen, he needed more than a doomed crew and a ship bound for England. He needed complete control of the narrative. And that meant ensuring that when the time came, there would only be one surviving witness, someone who would carry his story exactly as he intended. That part of the plan would unfold at sea. Ragnar never intended this crew to reach a battlefield. The men he gathered were old, brittle, and bought with bribes from his own silver. They were useful only as a costume piece, proof that he had tried to raise a raid. Once the ships pushed off from Kattegat, the mask had served its purpose. What followed was a voyage designed to collapse without taking him with it. The storm did the work first. Black water rose like a wall, masts bent, rigging screamed, and hulls vanished beneath waves that swallowed whole decks in a single breath. When daylight returned, the sea was littered with wreckage and bodies. What remained of Ragnar's so-called army crawled ashore drenched and shaking, more driftwood than men. On land, the truth was obvious. This crew could not fight. They could barely stand. Some wanted to turn back. Others begged for a plan that made sense. Ragnar did not argue. He did not comfort them. He looked at what stood before him and made a calculation. The ship was gone. There was no way home. If he allowed these survivors to scatter, they would become a problem in every direction. A handful of Vikings wandering the countryside would draw patrols, trigger alarms, and set the Saxons on edge long before Ragnar reached Ecbert. Even a ragged band of mercenaries reads as threat to a nervous kingdom. That threat would close gates and harden defenses, killing any chance to walk in quietly. There was another problem. If any of these men made it back to Kattegat, they could tell a story Ragnar could not control. They could say he had sailed with a joke of an army. They could reveal that he had walked into England with no intention of fighting. They could whisper that he had arranged his own capture. The martyrdom he was building would collapse under rumors of theater. He needed a clean account carried by one voice that would be believed. That voice would belong to his son. Ragnar's solution was cruel in its clarity. He began removing the crew one by one. There was no speech and no plea. It was the work of a man who had accepted the weight of necessary evil and refused to blink. The killings were not rage. They were prevention. No stray survivor would stumble into a village and spark a skirmish that ruined his approach. No bitter tongue would reach Kattegat with a version of events that undercut the cause he was crafting. The path to Ecbert had to be silent. The path home had to be a single thread. Ivar was that thread. Ragnar understood exactly how the Saxons would read a father and a crippled son arriving without guards or followers. Two figures, not a warband, a pair to be pitied, not feared. Ragnar even says as much. A cripple inspires no alarm. He used that perception like a key, turning a fortress into a doorway. With Ivar at his side, he could pass through fields and roads without triggering the military response a group of armed men would have summoned. The quiet mattered. He needed an audience with Ecbert, not a chase across Wessex. Leaving Ivar alive also served the purpose waiting on the other end of the plan. The story of Ragnar's death could not arrive in Kattegat as rumor. It had to arrive as testimony. Ivar would bring it with a voice no one would question. He would tell his brothers what happened. He would show them the bruise of it, the insult of it, and the shape of the enemy that did it. That story would not meander through taverns or die in the mouths of frightened old men. It would land like a blade on the council table and split every hesitation in two. The storm had stripped the voyage down to its bones. Ragnar finished the work with his own hands. What remained was the image he wanted the Saxons to see. Not a flotilla, not a raid, but a father and a son, tired and small and seemingly manageable. Behind that image sat the reality of his intent. England would not meet Ragnar in battle this time. England would host him. England would display him. England would do the one thing he needed his enemies to do: make a show of killing him. When the last of the crew lay still and the shore quieted, Ragnar's plan locked into place. No wandering mercenary would spook a garrison and slam a gate in his face. No stray witness would muddy Ivar's account. No return channel existed except the one Ragnar chose. He and Ivar set out across Wessex as a pair, the most disarming shape a Viking could take, and every mile brought them closer to the audience he wanted. The suicide army had done its job. It proved he had tried, and then it disappeared, taking with it every loose end that could break the spell. From here, the next moves would not be made with swords. They would be made with perception. A man who arrives without soldiers can be received. A man who looks beaten can be underestimated. A father with a crippled son can be handed off rather than executed on the spot. Ragnar counted on those instincts. He trusted the pride and vanity of kings. He needed an execution that would be witnessed, retold, and burned into memory. To reach that stage, he had to walk through the front door as something less than a threat. The killings, the wrecked ship, the silent coast, all of it cleared the way. What looked like madness on the beach was in fact precision. Ragnar turned a failed voyage into cover. He took a crew that could never win and used their existence to authenticate the mission, then used their absence to smooth his path and tighten the story. By the time he and Ivar began the approach to Ecbert's villa, the shape of the end was already visible. The Saxons would believe what they saw: a king without an army, a son without a legion, two figures who could be managed. That belief was the door. Ragnar had already chosen what waited on the other side. Ragnar's arrival in Wessex without an army was not a sign of weakness. It was the next deliberate step in his design. The smaller and less threatening he appeared, the easier it would be to gain access to the kings he needed to face. An army would have guaranteed resistance at every turn, but a father and his crippled son could move through enemy lands without raising immediate alarms. The plan relied on reaching a ruler who would not kill him instantly. Ragnar's history with Ecbert made that possible. Ecbert's respect for him, despite their betrayal-filled past, created the opening Ragnar needed. Ecbert could be trusted to delay judgment, to speak, to consider, and ultimately to transfer Ragnar to another's hands. That other had to be someone entirely unlike Ecbert. Ragnar's design required a death that would be public, humiliating, and unforgettable in the eyes of Norse culture. King Ælle fit that need perfectly. He was a ruler driven by pride and by the desire to make an example of his enemies. Ælle's way of dealing with Ragnar would ensure that news of his death would spread quickly, and that the manner of it would provoke outrage. The essence of Ragnar's plan at this stage was simple: reach Ecbert, be passed to Ælle, and die in a way that could not be ignored. This sequence would remove any ambiguity about the brutality of his end, and it would plant the exact image he needed in the minds of his sons and his people. Ragnar was no longer maneuvering armies or waging raids. He was maneuvering perceptions. Every step, from arriving in Wessex without a fighting force to ending up in Northumbria, was about setting the stage for a single event, his death becoming the catalyst for a unified Viking response. Ragnar understood the emotional calculus of his family. His sons were ambitious, stubborn, and in competition with one another. It would take more than politics or shared goals to unite them. It would take something personal. Ælle's public execution of their father was exactly that: an insult and a challenge none of them could ignore without dishonoring themselves. In the end, Ragnar's death was not the collapse of his power, but the culmination of it. He could no longer lead armies or hold a throne, but he could orchestrate the largest Viking invasion England had ever seen. And he did it without lifting a sword. His execution was the spark, the outrage, and the proof his sons needed to launch the Great Heathen Army, a force so large it fulfilled the dream Ragnar had once pursued through the Wessex settlement, taking and holding fertile English land for his people. Ragnar's real victory was turning his death into a weapon. Every humiliation he endured, every calculated step toward Ælle's execution ground, and every life he chose to take or spare along the way fed into one outcome. His enemies would kill him in a way that guaranteed their own destruction. That was the plan from the start. And it worked. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories and deeper looks into the moments everyone else misses. Thanks for watching. See you next time.